Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel, because after Philip's very kind and gracious shout out, there are a lot more people who are here, and I really hope that you enjoy the channel and that you can find some content that you find interesting. Today, the video that I want to do is based on the idea of foundational fantasy texts. So I'm going to be specifically talking about early fantasy novels. There is a lot of what I consider to be the foundation of fantasy in the old epics, in the old romantic stories, in the old folk tales of the past, and I would really love to see some of the booktubers that I admire, like Philip or Alan at the Library of Alexandria, talk about those topics, because I know that they could do them far greater justice than I ever would. So I would like to fast forward through time a little bit and talk about the novels that provided the basis or the foundation for modern fantasy as we know it. The novels that I want to talk about today are some of the foundational works that influenced the early frontrunners of what we consider to be modern fantasy, like Tolkien, like Lewis, like Mervyn Peake, some of those authors who created the great fantasy novels of kind of the middle of the 1900s. And these books are often a little shorter, they're perhaps less epic in scope, but they provided that foundation of the fantastic, of the hero's journey, of the magical creatures that went on to inspire the imaginations of those authors that created this genre that we all love so much. One of the works that I'm hoping to read over the next little while is a piece of nonfiction, and it's called The Tales Before Tolkien, The Roots of Modern Fantasy. So this is a collection of some of those early novels, some of those early novellas, short stories that inspired Tolkien and his generation of fantasy authors. I haven't really looked into the nonfiction that much, except for the fact that I saw it on Amazon and bought it for my Kindle. So I'm not really sure how in depth each of those passages is. I don't know if there are excerpts from these stories or if some of the short stories are included, but it is something that I'm going to be reading over the next month just to kind of broaden my own horizons and to make my own understanding of the fantasy genre a little richer. I'm hoping to do a follow-up to this video once I've read that book and I've read some of these early works, so I can comment on some of the literary techniques, some of the themes, some of the elements that made these stories so inspirational for the authors who came after. So I have that piece of nonfiction to kind of work through, and then there are four what I consider to be four early or foundational fantasy novels that I would like to read. I'll just do them in chronological order. So the first one is often regarded as one of the first fantasy novels for adults ever written, and that book is called Phantastes, and it's by George MacDonald. So I have actually read one of MacDonald's works. I've read The Princess and the Goblin. I was really interested. I really loved the movie The Princess and the Goblin as a little kid, the animated movie. And so I had read the novelization, the novel that came before the movie, and I really enjoyed it, but that is definitely geared more towards children. And apparently this novel is more centered or more kind of directed towards adults. I believe Phantastes was written in 1858, and I know that it was a major inspiration for C.S. Lewis. When I was reading around this book, I actually found a quote from Lewis after he had read this novel as a 16-year-old, and he said, I'm just going to look at my little paper here. So after reading Phantastes, he said, "That night my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized," which is a fantastic quote and such a relatable feeling when you read those first works of fantasy and you feel like there are parts of the world that are coming alive that you haven't experienced before. And it's nice sometimes to look back on those early writers of fantasy and see that they had similar experiences and that there were works so foundational to them, so intrinsic to the writers that they became, that they awoke a part of their minds like that. So I thought that was a really interesting quote, and I am looking forward to reading that book. I expect the prose and the style to be a little dense just because of the time period that it was written, but it is quite a short novel, so hopefully it won't take me too long to get through. So the second book is one that was written in 1922, and that is The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. So this is a story about two warring lords. I believe the inspiration comes in large part from Norse mythology, and I know that this book was a major source of inspiration for Ursula K. Le Guin, one of the early and great female fantasy authors. And I also believe, in terms of a little bit more of a modern scope, it was a major influence for Christopher Paolini as well. I know that his books are not as celebrated in the booktube community, but he did obviously get into fantasy at a very young age, and this was one of his early inspirations or early influences. The third novel that I'm hoping to read is The King of Elflynn's Daughter by Lord Duncany, and this is another British fantasy novel that I believe the basis of the plot is just as the title suggests. There is a lord or a king, and he would like a bride for his son, so his son goes off to fairyland in search of the king's daughter to bring her back to marry. I don't really know much more about it than that, except for the fact that it is acclaimed for its style, for its prose, and again, it is one of those early fantasy works that seems to have contributed greatly to the genre over time. The fourth and final book in this kind of series that I would like to read was published in 1926, and that is Lud in the Mist by Hope Merlis. So this book actually came on my radar for a different reason, as I was researching for a different set of videos. I know that this book was a huge inspiration for Neil Gaiman, and Neil Gaiman is one of my favorite fantasy authors of all time, and I have over the years tried to read particular books from his catalog of favorites and see how those books have influenced his work, how I can see the parts of his work that seem very related to those early novels that he wrote. And Lud in the Mist is one of the ones that he quotes as one of his top 10 favorite novels of all time. I believe that he describes it as one of the best fantasy novels in the English language. And I had never heard of it until I became a Neil Gaiman fan and had seen him talk about it either on his blog or in interviews. So I'm really looking forward to that one as well. So with that kind of one work of nonfiction and these four novels, all of which I have gotten on my Kindle because I think it's hard to pick some of them up in print, I am hoping that over the next month I'm going to be able to develop a little more of an appreciation for those novels that came before Tolkien and all of the fantasy writers of that generation. I am always really interested in author inspiration, where authors pull their ideas, the types of things that influence and impact them. And obviously there are events in people's lives that also influence their writing. It would be remiss for me to suggest even that only the novels that they have written have influenced the works that they have put out. But I think that what you read as an early reader definitely has an impact on your style of writing, on the things that you enjoy. So I do think that this will be a really interesting exercise. I expect, as I said, these books to perhaps be a little more dense in style of prose, a little less accessible than some of the modern fantasy that I've been reading a lot of lately. But I also find reading through those kinds of books really rewarding. And the fact that these are all much smaller than the kind of 900-page epic fantasy that we're used to reading now makes it feel a lot more manageable. So what I would like to ask all of you who are watching is if you have read any of these early foundational fantasy texts and what did you think of them? Are there any other novels that you would put on this list? And are there any authors who you have kind of looked through their interviews to find these inspirational texts for them, to find out which books influence the authors that you love the most? These are all questions that I love thinking about and love talking about, and I'm looking forward to coming back to do a part 2 of this video so that I can discuss all of my thoughts with all of you. But once again, if you are new to the channel, then welcome. I hope you decide to stick around and feel free to say hello in the comments, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye.